Oh, so where should I go? That's not working.
It was working, yeah.
Okay, good evening. We're finally up and running. A few technical things to figure out. Good evening. My name is Joel Berkowitz. I'm director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies here at UWM and a professor of English. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Faye Sigmund Woman of Valor Lecture. We're proud to continue to add to this long-standing series that honors the memory of Faye Greenberg Sigmund, the mother of Myra Taxman and the late Lee Temkin. These lectures are dedicated to prominent women who contributed to Jewish history, society, and culture. The series was established in 2001 with a generous gift from Myra Taxman, along with her late husband Royal and the late Lee and Bud Temkin. In ongoing conversations over the years with Myra and with Royal and Lee when they were still with us, I have had the chance to learn about Faye Greenberg Sigmund's many gifts and special qualities, such features as her warmth, her humaneness, her love of learning, her Menschlichkeit, and her Yiddishkeit. She clearly passed those on to her daughters, who in turn raised their own children in that spirit. My colleagues and I in UWM's Jewish Studies program are always honored and delighted to honor Faye Sigmund's memory through this series, and we're happy to be joined, whether virtually or in person, by members of the Taxman and Temkin families. And speaking of how people are joining, I want to send a very warm welcome to those of you who are here in the room with us. It's so good to have you with us, and also to a number of people who are joining on Zoom. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Our speaker tonight, as you all know, is Professor Jodi Eichler-Levine from Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and her topic is Bezalel's Daughters, How Jewish Women Make Objects. In a moment, I will bring up my colleague, Professor Simon Bronner, to introduce our speaker. Before that, a few words of thanks and a couple of logistical things. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, and we have a new co-sponsor, which we're very excited about, the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts in Cedarburg. And at UWM, our co-sponsors are the Department of Anthropology and the programs in Museum Studies and Women's and Gender Studies. So thank you all for your interest and for helping to spread the word. Also, thanks to Classroom Services, whose support is so vital for these programs. We're always grateful to Jay Piney for his guidance, and we're joined tonight by Kang Sen Lor, who has made sure that we're all set up here properly. Very special thanks to my colleague and friend, Professor Rachel Baum, a Deputy Director of the Stahl Center, for the many things she has done and is doing, including monitoring the Zoom this evening and the Zoom Q&A. So grateful for all of Rachel's work, and to our office manager, Susan Wagner, who has helped things move along smoothly to this evening. There will be a Q&A for both the in-person and online audience, so I will go around with a mic if you have questions in the room. And Rachel, as I said, will be watching. If you're on Zoom and you want to ask a question at any time, we'll ask them at the end, but if you think of something as our speaker is talking, feel free to drop it in the Q&A, and then Rachel will feed questions for our speaker to respond to. And finally, from me, we have feedback cards that I hope those of you in the room have gotten, and online there will be a survey for people to fill out, which we encourage you to do. Particularly if you're not on our mailing list yet, we would love to have your contact details, or if you have moved and need to give us a new address. And we'd also just like to hear what you think of the program. What we often do in these situations is to encourage that, we have some swag, and we have some fitting swag tonight for one of these for the in-person attendees and one for the folks on Zoom. Professor Eichler-Levine's book, Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis, How Jews Craft Resilience and Create Community. So this lovely book will go to one of you who completes the card. And with that, I am going to pass the mic to my colleague, Simon J. Bronner, Distinguished Professor of Social Sciences at UWM and a member of the Jewish Studies Advisory Committee. Professor Bronner is a past winner of the National Jewish Book Award and current editor of the journal Jewish Folklore and Ethnology. Since Simon's scholarship intersects with that of our speakers in a number of ways, he is the perfect person to introduce her. Thank you, Simon. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Let me reiterate the welcome to the 2025 Faye Greenberg Sigmund Women of Valor Lecture, made possible by the generosity of the Taxman and Temkin families and hosted by the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies at UWM. And let me give recognition of my years of connection to its director, Professor Joel Berkowitz, as well as the coordinator, Professor Rachel Baum. Give them a hand. They do hard work. This is easy given an introduction. Although I didn't recognize the IT person. Okay. Women of Valor, Eshet Chagil, refers to the biblical phrase, Proverbs, describing women of strength, courage, and worth. And it is truly appropriate for today's presentation on women crafting objects. Let me say a bit more about Faye Greenberg Sigmund, giving her honor of blessed memory, for whom this lecture is named. She was also such a woman of valor. Born in Milwaukee, she passed away in 2008, but not before organizing the Moses Montefiore Synagogue Religious School and serving as its principal for 35 years. She also was active in Hadassah and the League of Women Voters in Appleton, Wisconsin. Truly community engaged and fulfilling the ideas of service. I am Simon Bronner, and in addition to being a proud member of the Jewish Studies Advisory Committee, let me also say I'm a member of the Museum Studies Committee, so I'm also glad that there's that intersection as well with material culture. It is truly my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's eminent speaker, Dr. Jodi Eichler-Levine, Philip and Muriel Berman, Professor of Jewish Civilization and Professor of Religious Studies at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. I should point out she also has a Wisconsin connection, having taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. So if we have someone from that area, she'll be glad to speak to you about her memories there. She is the author of Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis, How Jews Craft Resilience and Create Community, that was published by the University of North Carolina Press. And you should also know, Suffer the Little Children, Uses of the Past in Jewish and African American Children's Literature, that was published by New York University Press. She describes her research and writing as seeking answers to the questions of how and why people make meaning through everyday actions and how the stories they will shape tell reality, whether they are stories of family heirlooms, a beloved children's book, or a trip to Disney World, which is the subject of her current research. I first got to know her work as editor of a related topic, Mothers in the Jewish Cultural Imagination. And I dare say that her bold, insightful essay on Maurice Sendak helped secure awards for the book that included the National Jewish Book Award and the Barbara Dopkin Award in Women's Studies. Thank you, Jodi, for that. In the years since, we've had many interactions, partly because of our Pennsylvania connections, but also of mutual interests in material culture as well as in narrative. And currently, we're also collaborating and meeting again, and our paths are crossing on an ambitious multi-volume cultural history of Judaism from the beginning of Judaism to the present. I am not the editor of that, thank God, but Jodi and I are working on separate chapters of just the 20th century. The subject of tonight's talk is what academics might term material and visual culture. But I want to editorialize that I think it stands out for its interdisciplinary and intertextual vistas that work on the intersections of religion, popular culture, folk culture, politics, race, and gender. It is also ambitious and sweeping, and I am sure you will be provoked, you will be scintillated and enlightened. We here are blessed with her sharing her knowledge and insights with the provocative title of Bezazel's daughter, How Jewish Women Make Objects. Please give a warm UW welcome to Dr. Eichler-Levine. Do you want the microphone back?
You want me to use the lavalier microphone or the handheld microphone, as long as we're doing a tech show? I can use the handheld. That'll do. Let's hope for the best. Okay. Well, good evening. Hello, Wisconsin. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Simon, for that beautiful introduction. I'm so honored. I'm truly honored to be giving this lecture, and I was so influenced by Dr. Bronner's work when I began working on the book you'll hear a little bit about today. So it's really an honor. Immense thanks to everyone who worked so hard to make this happen, especially Susan Wagner, who I can tell makes the center go, and especially Dr. Rachel Baum and Dr. Joel Berkowitz. I run a Jewish Studies Center, and I've been having just the best time visiting, and I can tell by how hard they work that it's amazing watching everything go here, and the Stahl Center is really wonderful. I apologize if I'm leaving anyone else out. As you heard, I spent the first 8 years of my career up the road at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, so right up 41. So it's a thrill to return to the Badger State, particularly in April rather than in December. So when you think of Jewish sacred objects, you don't usually think about, come on, you can do it. This is always the nature of technology. Let's make sure we got this. You don't usually think about Barbie. But Ruth Moscow Handler, Barbie's creator, pictured here, was a nice Jewish girl from Los Angeles. The Barbie doll, named for her daughter, Barbara Jean, was initially mocked at the annual 1959 Toy Fair in New York City. The other toy makers, mostly men, were sure it would fail. Handler wanted girls to have a doll who was an adult, to relate to a doll who was someone they aspired to be rather than someone they should mother. As a person who vastly preferred the boardroom to the nursery, she created Barbie so girls could relate to a doll in a new way. Barbie would go on to become an all-American icon, then the star, of course, of her own blockbuster 2023 movie. I begin with Barbie, and I'll return to her later, because she is the Jewish object you don't realize is a Jewish object. She's not a Torah cover or a pair of Shabbat candlesticks, but she is just as vital for telling Jewish women's stories. She is all-American, but even more so. I also begin with her because she was the dream child of a Jewish woman who, like the woman of valor, aspired to manage it all, yet ultimately sometimes couldn't. And I begin with her because Barbie, that freewheeling California girl riding on her own road, reminds me of some other ladies of liberty and the worlds they created. So next I want to say a word about this lecture's title. Why is this talk called Bezalel's Daughters? Bezalel is the name of the chief artisan who designs the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. You did not think you were here for a Bible lecture. I'm sorry about the bait and switch. Bezalel, so I'm a scholar of Jews in North America, not North Africa or the ancient Near East or any of these settings of the stories of the Hebrew Bible, nor am I a scholar of the Second Temple period when the Hebrew Bible, as we now know it, began to coalesce. But what Dr. Vincent Wimbish calls scripturalization, the ongoing multi-webbed lives of sacred texts, is always all around us. Jews continue to interact with the stories of the Hebrew Bible through the yearly cycle of Torah readings and through generations of interpretation. Scripture is not just about ideas. It's also about embroidery and stories, copper and linen, wool and gold, tactility. Text in Latin comes to us from textus, weaving, web, woven. It is to the figure of Bezalel that many Jews still turn when they think about art and craft. In Israel, as many of you probably know, Bezalel is the name of a famous art academy. And by total, genuine coincidence, I did not plan this. Last week, Jews around the world read Parashat Pekudei, which means accounting, in the yearly cycle of Torah readings. This weekly Torah reading in the book of Exodus includes one of the sections where Bezalel is very much the star. So here's an excerpt. Now Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, had made all that the divine had commanded Moses. At his side was Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, carver and designer and embroiderer in blue, purple, and crimson yarns and in fine linen. On the hem of the robe, they made pomegranates of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, twisted. They also made bells of pure gold and attached the bells between the pomegranates all around the hem of the robe. Between the pomegranates, a bell and a pomegranate, a bell and a pomegranate, all around the hem of the robe for officiating in. And so this text remained really important for all of the women I interviewed when I was working on my book. This is one example from Bonnie Vorspan, a quilter and embroiderer. By the way, I have been to Cedarburg, Wisconsin, home of the Quilt Museum, and there's also a really fabulous fabric store there, or at least there was in 2007. Bonnie embroidered this exact verse from the book of Exodus, and you can see there she's incorporating the colors from the biblical text itself, and there's a little bit of a close-up. Arlene Diane Spector, also of the Pomegranate Guild, but Philadelphia, did this quilted wall hanging that references the same idea using pomegranate fabric. So many biblical stories are about passing down knowledge from father to son, or from master to apprentice. Bezalel has Oholiab. But what if Bezalel had had a woman apprentice? What if he had had daughters? I call this talk in one chapter of my book, Bezalel's Daughters, because even in the book of Exodus, stories of creation are more complex than that of a master and apprentice. And because today, thousands of Jewish women have taken up this task. When I was researching my book on craft culture, here is your shameless plug, and thank you for having the book here. I learned that these stories of Bezalel and the creation of the tabernacle were indeed vital for the women I was studying. Ida Aber, one of the founders of the Long Island chapter of the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework, begins her 1979 book with a discussion of these sections from Exodus. She too points to Bezalel, but she quickly pivots from Bezalel as designer to Bezalel as convener, as one who, quote, put together what everyone else had prepared. So he's sort of a community organizer. And she says, there is no other single artistic enterprise mentioned in the Bible as being under divine protection. From this, we know that the plastic and graphic artists held a singular position in the Jewish community. What is most extraordinary is that while the people of Israel were still in the desert, they prepared all the materials for the making of the tabernacle. This is my favorite line. They were even asked to stop because too much had been prepared. And indeed, in the years I spent researching Jews and craft culture, an abundance of items were always prepared. At a synagogue knitting circle in Pennsylvania, piles and piles of lap blankets and shawls were created to donate to chemotherapy patients. At the 2017 Biennial Convention of the Pomegranate Guild, which was held in Atlanta, Georgia, chapter banners adorned with pomegranates completely covered a wall of the large convention center. Pillows on the conference's theme, I Have a Dream, abounded. Centerpieces of pomegranates and peaches married the rimon, which is Hebrew for pomegranate, with the state fruit of Georgia. In Jewish homes around the country, I found piles of challah covers, matzah decals, Sukkot wall hangings, prayer caps, and other Jewish objects simply abounded. Too much? Who can say? But while the sections of the Hebrew Bible about the creation of the tabernacle do sometimes describe women's contributions, there's even a fantastic midrash about an earlier part of Exodus where the women are spinning goat's hair, and the Hebrew's a little bit ambiguous, and so there's a midrash or interpretation where the women actually spin the goats. Love it. Bezalel himself does not literally have any daughters. So where are the women creators in the Bible, and where are they today? So obviously, this brings us to the biblical text under which we all gather today. I have to admit, it's really funny that I am giving a Woman of Valor lecture. It is beyond an honor. I sort of was crying over there while everyone was introducing me. And I'm really meaning no disrespect with what I'm about to say. So please take this with some humor. But the Woman of Valor, the Eshet Chayal, and I have a complicated history. She's very old, most famously, as Dr. Bronner told you. You can find the Eshet Chayal in Proverbs chapter 31. Eshet Chayal mi yimsa, a woman of valor who can find her. In one JPS translation of Proverbs 31:10, we read, what a rare find is a capable wife. This is also where you get the famous line, her worth is far beyond that of rubies. Capable wife is one translation. Many scholars note instead the semantic resonance between chayal and the words for courage, bravery, soldiery, fighting, and thus the common translation, woman of valor. This poem comes out of a branch of texts called wisdom literature and remains part of Jewish practice today. It has been a living, spoken, performed text for centuries. Some Jewish husbands recite it to their wives on Friday nights. It is often intoned at Jewish women's funerals. But friends, a secret. I have hated this poem since graduate school. I guess this is no longer a secret. During my first semester working on my PhD, I took a class on Hebrew Bible wisdom literature. I was also at a point in my early 20s where I started to see firsthand what double standards and gender bias look like for women. The passage from Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, describes an extraordinarily busy woman, one overseeing a vast household, finding food, spinning, giving to the poor. Her mouth is full of wisdom. She never eats the bread of idleness. When you really look at the poem, you can start to get a little bit stressed out. In Hebrew, it says, "V'takam ba'od laila," and she rises while it is still night. She plants vineyards, sees to her estates, spins, gives to the poor, keeps her household well clothed, and her lamp never goes out. And in the end, she is praised not for herself or even for her works or even because she has served her husband so well, but for her fear of the divine, which is typical of wisdom literature, but still. I get exhausted just reading this passage. It's a recipe for burnout, I think. Though I am familiar now, many years later, with countless different readings, beautiful readings of the Eshet Chayal. I was only about 23 years old when I told my future husband, "Don't let anyone read this passage at my funeral." But the woman of valor was not done with me. She is a common figure in both historical and contemporary Jewish women's crafting. For one thing, she crafts. She works at the spindle. She gives us a vision of a woman who makes things with her hands and a powerful woman overseeing a household economy. She is a figure of wisdom. And so she doggedly followed me throughout my research. Here she is on an early 20th century German challah cover, a silk-painted challah cover from the Skirball collection in California. Here she is on a silk challah cover, hand-painted by New York City-based artist Sarah Jacobs, and in a quilt and applique hanging by, again, Philadelphia-based artist Arlene Diane Spector. And here you can see she's got the biblical text itself at the center, surrounded by applique, embroidery, and mirrors. The woman of valor is perhaps not omnipresent, but always with us. I'm learning to live with her in a tense relationship between love for the bountiful work of her hands and still a bit of anger at the apogee of effortless perfection she represents. A bit more on that later. Remember that part about how the Eshet Chayal's lamp never goes out? There's another famous woman whose lamp is not supposed to go out. And she brings me to my next few examples. One day in the early 1940s, a little girl named May, the daughter of Jewish immigrants, performed in a patriotic pageant at her Yiddish school in the Bronx. This is not her. This photograph, in fact, is Golda Meyerson, more likely known to you as Golda Meir, performing as the Statue of Liberty in a very similar pageant right here in Milwaukee on May 18th, 1919. And I'd like to mention that this comes from the digital collections of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I highly recommend their collection on Golda Meir. It's beautiful. But this is an earlier version of the kind of pageant that my artist describes. The woman who was born May Cecilia Shafter a few years later performed in a similar role, except that it was themed for the holiday of Hanukkah. Here is how she describes it. 8 of us, draped in sheets, wearing paper crowns, holding books in our left hands and candles in our rights, were lined up across the stage. A ninth child, the shamash, or leader candle, lit our candles one at a time. As she did so, we raised our candles in the air and recited a line from Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus. The parents wept, and we were proud because that poem was us. Our parents had immigrated to the land of the free, the golden and Medina. We were the wretched refuse, and we were breathing free. It was a great feeling. This girl would grow up not to become the prime minister of Israel, but to become an artist. First, working under the name May Shafter Rockland, then finally as May Rockland Tupa. She wrote one of the first widely published Jewish craft books, The Work of Our Hands, and has shown all over the world. In 1974, Tupa combined dime store tchotchkes, like little tiny flags, and plastic statues of liberty to create a menorah/art piece called Miss Liberty, which today is in the collection of the Jewish Museum in New York City. Miss Liberty contains the words of Emma Lazarus, a 19th century poet, activist, and philanthropist whose poem, The New Colossus, was used to raise funds for a pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. I lift my lamp beside the golden door, the Hanukkah says on its base, against a backdrop of somewhat gaudy American flags. The piece is a political statement that works on many levels. On the one hand, it celebrates the success of immigrants like Tupa's own parents. On the other hand, Tupa knew her parents were the lucky ones because they made it here before the immigration quotas of the mid-1920s. Half of the statues have turned their backs to the viewer. As Tupa says in her artist statement, quote, "There have been times when Miss Liberty looked away and America closed its doors to the persecuted, as when the steamship St. Louis was denied haven in Miami and 900 Jews were sent back to Nazi Germany." So I always include a picture of Miss Liberty on the front of my syllabus for my American Judaism class. And I love to talk about it for several reasons. It's provocative. Its meaning changes every time I teach the course as the world keeps changing. And it introduces us to two different important Jewish women who lived in different centuries. I want to pair Tupa's Miss Liberty with two other objects or examples to give us a Jewish American triptych, if you will. And there's Emma Lazarus, the author of the poem. The first object is a Torah mantle or cover created by Los Angeles-based artist Peachy Levy. It was commissioned by the Skirball Cultural Center in LA and can be found at the entrance to its Project Americana exhibition. Ukratem dror ba'aretz, it says in Hebrew. In English, proclaim liberty throughout the land. In her artist statement, Levy explains how the quotation is connected to the observance of the Jubilee year, an extension of the sabbatical year, a break for the land. It is incumbent upon us to treat the land and by extension other humans justly, she says. On the patriotic side of the equation, she explains that, quote, the red and white stripes symbolize the American flag, and repeat the quotation in English because the signers of the Declaration of Independence selected those words to be used on the Liberty Bell, and in doing so, embraced a central concept of Torah. So with the Liberty Bell, I give a nod to my current home state. It's down the road from where I live. I saw this Torah cover in person in April 2017, the same week that I came to LA to interview a variety of artists, including Peachy Levy herself. When you enter the Skirball's permanent exhibition, it's the very first thing that you see. She created it in 1991. That's more than 4 decades ago now, at a time in the early 1990s when American Jews had become increasingly at home in the US. And in the mid-1990s, with peace in Israel looking like a bit of a possibility, American Jews were focusing on their own stories. In fact, some scholars are now asking if the 1990s were something of a golden age for American Jews. The values of freedom, rest, and respect are all predominant in this piece. In our interview, Levy told me, quote, It is my intention to bring Jewish values to the audience. It's what I believe in. I try to make things beautiful, but beautiful alone is not a value to me, end quote. And my third example on these themes of freedom in America comes from a much more recent series of paintings, so we're not all textiles today, by Siona Benjamin, who I know has visited here in Milwaukee and visited Lehigh last fall. Benjamin was born in Mumbai, India, and now works out of northern New Jersey, with backgrounds in fine art, community art, and theater design. Her work frequently explores the intersection of her Indian, Jewish, and American identities, which you can see here. And you can see quite a lot going on in terms of symbolism, the flag, the menorah, and many other examples. She actually created an entire series of 14 paintings around the theme of liberty. Like May Rockland Tupa, she took Emma Lazarus's New Colossus as her inspiration. Like Tupa, she approaches the poem with a mix of reverence and critique. And I usually try to avoid long quotes because that's sort of bad form, but her artist statement is worth reproducing in full here. To some Americans, she writes, the words of Emma Lazarus in 1883, written at the base of the Statue of Liberty, are our national credo. Others say it's our national curse. What do you think? Credo? Curse? Neither? When we don't want to group certain people into a negative category, why do we subsequently put another group into a similarly unfair category without even realizing it? What happens when our different ideas of justice clashes? Do we develop a hatred for one religion when we are fighting for the persecution and injustices of another group or group of people? Do we even realize that we do this involuntarily and subconsciously? What is the meaning of liberty and justice for all? What is the price we pay, both in our communities and within our personal belief? In this Liberty Art series, I have made beautiful textures and colors and contrasted it with falling, crouching, flying, sleeping, tired, tempest-tossed, homeless, and vulnerable bodies. Washed ashore or cast into the ocean, huddled or yearning to breathe free, again or for the first time. These blue foreign bodies yearn to lift their lamps beside their own golden thresholds. The color of blue, a signature one for Benjamin and how she imagines herself, is associated with the ocean and sky, resonating with her own experience of migration and that of other immigrants. The series has moments of moodiness, mysticism, and longing. Each corresponds to a word or phrase from Lazarus's poem. This is "You're Tired," which shows a blue woman with angelic wings nestled on the ground near the bottom of the frame. The penultimate piece in the series, "I Lift My Lamp Aside," has a blue-skinned woman emerging out of a fiery wheel. In the center of the wheel is the word Shema, here, a central part of Jewish liturgy. Here's how it looks if we think about all three of these works together, as if they were a triptych. In Tupas from the 1970s, Emma Lazarus makes a promise that Lady Liberty, turning her back, can't always keep. In the 1990s, Peachy Levy's Torah mantle proudly proclaims liberty not in the form of a woman, but in the form of Torah, which is sometimes personified as a tree of life, sometimes anthropomorphized a little bit like a woman. And she harkens back to the promises of Philadelphia and the Liberty Bell. She links justice for humanity with justice for the earth and with rest. In 2018, in the tumultuous, tempestuous 21st century, Benjamin fragments Lazarus's poem as the country itself polarizes and ruptures. Hers is a storm-tossed vision, but still one with angelic messengers and moments of light. That's an interesting Freudian slip. I want to turn us now from the national to the more personal, from civic ritual and symbolism to life cycle ritual in the form of the wimple. So my research took me back and forth between past and present. And I often found myself looking at old Jewish objects in a museum and then seeing new versions of them in someone's home. On that same Southern California trip, I met a woman who was doing a new version of the wimple, which also could be found in the Skirball Museum. So in early 17th century Germany, the custom of the wimple was born. A wimple was made from the swaddling cloth used at a baby's brit milah or ritual circumcision. Mothers and other women of the family would take the swaddling cloth, cut it into long strips, which would then be connected into one long strip, and would decorate it through painting or embroidery. Then the family would donate the cloth to their synagogue. It would be wrapped around a Torah scroll to keep it closed as a binder or belt. Often, if the boy reached young adulthood, and remember when we think about early modern childhood mortality, that is sadly an if, the scroll might be used when he became a bar mitzvah might be wrapped in the same wimple. The wimple seems like a quiet object, and these are a few more examples from the Skirball collection. Yet, I think it's a feminist one, anachronistically. It symbolizes how women became a key part of synagogue ritual long before they were permitted to count in a minyan or prayer quorum or lead prayer. Women could not approach the physical Torah scroll in early modern Europe, but their stitches could. They could delicately bind them to it. It was a public yet intimate kind of connection. Women also designed and sewed many other ritual objects, like the parochet, or the curtain before the ark. And my favorite example, which is obviously a little bit later, includes a painting of Pinocchio. So obviously they didn't consult the Walt Disney Company for copyright. The wimple has had a recent revival. Many of the women I interviewed for my book had made them. And they became so popular while I was writing the book that the Forward, which is a Jewish newspaper, ran a story called, quote, "The Rise of the Wimple." Many Jews started to make wimples with a little bit of a reverse chronology in advance so that they could make them and use them at the Brit Milah as a decorative object rather than being decorated after it. And in some cases, they were used again at the Bar Mitzvah. This is Zelda. In 1988, she made a wimple for her grandson. I interviewed her and took this photograph in 2017. Like many others, this wimple welcomes the child into the covenant, Brit, and wishes for it a life of Torah, chuppah, or wedding canopy, and ma'asim tovim, or good deeds. Zelda was an early member of the Pomegranate Guild. In our interview, she said, "I feel a connection to the past. I feel that I'm in some way opening a road to the future with it. My children have all these things. They will remember me doing what I made. You could see I do a lot of Jewish things. That way, I'm very, very Orthodox." She's one of many women I interviewed who made objects connected to life cycle events, wimples, pillows for baby namings, and other ways of welcoming children into the community. Prayer shawls or talitot and kippot or skull caps for b'nai mitzvot and others. Zelda draws our attention to how objects exist at the fulcrum of the present and the past, and at the hinge between communal celebration and individual reflection. Zelda was a late octogenarian when I met her. She died about 2 years ago. Her objects remind us that so much of Jewish life happens in quiet spaces, like living rooms, and sometimes in meditative solitude. But sometimes life happens both in private and in public, which brings us back to Barbie and her descendants. So what about Ruth Moscow? Ruth Moscow was born in Denver, Colorado in 1916 to immigrant Jewish parents. She was the youngest of 10 children. Her mother was by then exhausted and ill, and her older sister Sarah essentially raised her. As a very young woman, she headed out to California, settling in Los Angeles. Eventually, her high school boyfriend, Izzy Handler, followed her. Izzy, who soon went by Elliot, in part because Ruth feared discrimination, was the half of the pair who was good at making things with his hands. But it was Ruth, the overseer of the household economies, like the woman of valor in that way. It was Ruth who ran their small toy company, Mattel. It was Ruth who made a deal with the Walt Disney Studios and ABC to advertise their toys on the Mickey Mouse Club, making them one of the first toy companies in television, which increased their sales dramatically in the mid-1950s. And it was Ruth who created Barbie. Ruth wanted to create a new fashion doll who looked like an adult woman with a variety of outfits and roles. As is widely known, the inspiration for Barbie's form came on a trip to Switzerland with her family when she and her daughter Barbara saw a German, quote, Lily doll in a shop window. So ultimately, of course, we all know that Barbie was an immense success. Not just a success, but an icon. It's always been a bit ironic that this portrait of a blonde, quote-unquote, all-American, unattainable beauty standards was created by an Ashkenazi Jewish woman who, by all accounts, was quite beautiful, but certainly not blonde. Now, there is, of course, no one way to look Jewish. I spend like all of my time in the classroom telling my students this. Jews are blonde, brunette, redheaded, white, black, Asian, Latina, and dozens of other things. And here's Ruth later in life. 64 years after her creation, Barbie and her Jewish mother had their moment on the big screen in Greta Gerwig's 2023 box office smash. The film mostly erased Ruth Moscow Handler's Jewishness, unless you were looking for it in her accent. When she reveals herself most fully near the movie's climax, played by the indomitable Rhea Perlman, her timing has an undeniably Ashkenazi Jewish comedy flavor. You expect Barbie's creator to look like Barbie? I can't do Rhea Perlman, I'm sorry. And she jokes about her tax evasion and says, but that's another movie. In the film, the Handler character very, very briefly mentions her double mastectomy, a true story. She was a breast cancer survivor at a time when survival rates were much lower, and she had an entire second career in external breast prosthetics. But even though Ruth in the film does not appear as that explicitly Jewish, Jewish themes surfaced elsewhere in the life and afterlife, the scripturalization, if you like, of the Barbie movie. Barbie writer and director Greta Gerwig is not Jewish, but her discussions of the film were deeply Jewish adjacent. In one long-form interview, she described how growing up near an Orthodox Jewish family, her close friends influenced her worldview, and that she would often spend Shabbat with her neighbors. She was particularly moved by the traditional Friday night parental practice of parents giving blessings over children, and it seems that this family included her in their blessings. I remember feeling this sense of whatever your wins and losses were for the week, whatever you did and didn't do, when you come to this table, your value has nothing to do with that. You are a child of God. I put my hand over you, and I bless you as a child of God at this table, and that's your value. I remember feeling so safe in that feeling, so like enough. And this is the author of the article, she imagines people going to the temple of the movies to see Barbie on a hot summer day, sitting in the air-conditioned dark, feeling transported, laughing, maybe crying, and then coming out into the bright, burning heat. I want people to feel like I did at Shabbat dinner, she said. I want them to get blessed. I want them to get blessed. You can actually see this play out in the relationship between Ruth and Barbie near the close of the film. And the push and pull tension between creator, creation, and creativity. Barbie is having her Pinocchio moment. Should she become a real girl? Human? mortal? Ruth tells Barbie that being human is, most of all, uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable makes humans create ideas, she says, like patriarchy and Barbie. And then you die, she deadpans. She warns Barbie that she has to give her a sense of what she is in for. And here we see what many other observers have noted is a Michelangelo moment. The two join hands in a juxtaposition that resembles God and Adam's hands on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, except here the gap is bridged. Here the hands touch. And Ruth tells Barbie, now, feel. Barbie sees images of real women and girls living their lives. She cries. She says, yes. Barbie gets blessed and touches the sense that leads her there. If I may, I'm going to take us to the very end of this talk by sharing a story from my own life. So I was a knitter years before I began this book research. I was in graduate school and, dissertations don't get done, but when you're knitting, there's something tactile there. In the process of participant observation for this book, I started to learn other crafts like embroidery and needlepoint. But I was scared of sewing machines, terrified, as I told many people when I interacted with these amazing quilters and other seamstresses. As it happens, a bit over a year ago, my own daughter became a bat mitzvah. In spite of the very small size of her 8-person Hebrew school class, our synagogue gave out her date and her Torah portion years in advance. In fact, before the pandemic began in February of 2020. And as it happened, it was the Torah portion that came around in synagogues again just last week. That's right, Parashat Pekudei. That same Torah portion I mentioned before, the one with Bezalel and Aholiab, with pomegranates and bells on the hem of the priestly robe, with the blue, purple, and crimson embroidery I had been reading about for years. So it became very clear to me that my mission as scholar and mother was to sew her bat mitzvah talit or prayer shawl myself. And of course, I would need to make a test prayer shawl for my husband. And of course, I would need to make one for myself as well. No fear of sewing machines could stop me. So I bought a proper machine long before the event, determined to figure it out. But as happens in life, times of joy are mixed with times of difficulty. And that year happened to be especially chaotic, particularly during the final 3 months before the bat mitzvah. The sewing machine remained for a long time in its box in our garage. And so, of course, I found myself, like every student ever, cramming so much sewing of 3 prayer shawls into the final days before the events. Fortunately, it was Lehigh spring break. It was both a meditative and powerful experience. I embroidered pomegranates, which you can see there on the atara, or neck piece of her talit, while at another young person's Sunday bar mitzvah. It was a process. It was a mess. Wrapping the fringes or seat was simultaneously mundane. A friend helped me figure it out using a YouTube video at my dining room table. And yet it was also a little bit like an incantation. I stayed up late one night wrapping the fringes that make a tallis a tallis. It's the fringes that make it a ritual object, counting and restating the intention. I finished my own prayer shawl about 20 minutes before we had to go to the pre-bat mitzvah staged photos, wrapping and tying the last fringe before I ran upstairs to put on a dress. Yet this experience also reminded me of the history of Jewish labor over objects. My neck and upper back ached from constantly looking over my work. My lower back and legs grew tired as I stretched and measured yards of fabric, aligning rulers, cutting pieces. This, too, is Jewish American history. My dining room table in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was obviously not a sweatshop on the Lower East Side. But all of those years of Jewish sewists and tailors so often invoked by the women I had interviewed, bent over their work, just seemed to come to mind. And they reminded me that stitching might be magical and wonderful, but it is also work. And it makes me think of Barbie, of her plastic bodies and her tiny clothes, produced by workers in factories all over the world, sometimes under good conditions. Handler gave some interesting interviews in her life, but more often, especially in recent years, under poor ones. In the end, I return, as always, to hands. Rabbi Adina Allen writes that we are all created creative. The reason I think that both the Barbie movie and the Pomegranate Guild are actually two of the most radical Jewish feminist things of the last 100 years is because they demand that we feel and that we create. And they both acknowledge that we don't get to do much more than that in the limited time given to us. Was Ruth Handler a woman of valor? Is Barbie? Are any of us? In a whirling of endless work and creation, it is helpful too to remember that Jewish tradition offers a rest from work, a Sabbath, and the sabbatical year that Peachy Levy stitched carefully onto her Torah cover. So without any easy answers, I hope to give you an exhale, a rest, and a reminder of the touch of objects present and past. Thank you.
Jodi, thank you so much for that lively and fascinating and beautifully illustrated talk. It's really just perfect, and with connections to Milwaukee as well as a bonus. So much for us to reflect on, think about, respond to. And so we open this up to responses both in the room and in the virtual room. How about the former first? Who wants to get us started? Yes, I'm going to go to Bev first.
Well, I love the idea of rest. I wondered, however, is there a reason the work of Judy Chicago was not included in some of this? Only time, just because she so much engaged with stitching and object and women and
Yes.
at the Brooklyn Museum with the dinner party, so.
Yeah, no, the only reason was really sort of time and not having an easy in with the playing around with the Statue of Liberty. In an earlier draft, actually, she was there. I don't know if this mic is on. But yes, the dinner party is so important and something that I think about a lot. In fact, one of my colleagues, Anthony Petro, who's moving from Boston University to Notre Dame, has some new work out on Judy Chicago that I'm really excited to read. So really just a matter of time and that other people have discussed her, but she's really vital.
Thank you.
I'll just ask you quickly about what you attribute the revival of interest in creation of wimples to. The other example that you gave of the creation of shawls, I think predates that. And so if you also, whether you see that as a continuity or a follow-up or something separate.
I might use the mic, I'm not sure if the sure. I think there's a few things going on with the Wimples. I think it's partially like a lot of, because it was a German and to some extent Italian tradition, it's partially about a nostalgia for specifically German American Jews, but all the Jews creating them now are not necessarily descended from German Jews. They're often descended from Russian Jews or Jews, from the Pale of Settlement. So I think it's partially a revival of interest in naming ceremonies, right? Because it's in the 1990s, especially as people start to develop naming ceremonies for girls alongside boys, that naming ceremonies and birth, new baby ceremonies in general with Jewish renewal and other movements rise. And so I think the interest in the Wimple is partially a re-interest in Brit Milah as people become more interested in naming ceremonies as there's cognate ceremonies for girls, and B, people start to retake Brit Milah as a religious ritual rather than something you just do in the hospital. They start to actually revive it. So I think that's part A. And part B, I think, is just that it takes a long time for a lot of these museums, like the Skirball, like the Magnus collection at Berkeley, like the Jewish Museum in New York. It's in the 70s that a lot of this preservation work has really happened, and it just takes time for things to filter down, right? For scholars like Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimlet, who's doing the catalogs for these exhibits a long time ago. It takes time for that to filter down for enough people to see the Wimples in collections and to think about it, and then that spreads through organizations like the Pomegranate Guild in analog ways in the 70s and 80s through their newsletters and conventions. And then I think it's also the digital turn that leads to the explosion of the Wimple, because all craft practices, once you have the World Wide Web, all craft practices just explode more quickly. And so the Wimple becomes another thing where people are like, oh, look at that. And they can learn about Wimples without going to the physical collection. So I think it's a combination of factors.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a weird question. I just recently learned that Ruth Handler was Jewish as well. But what made you pick her? Like, why did you choose her over any other woman? Like, how do I explain this? There are many different Jews who have created things in the past, like, I don't have one that's coming to me currently. But what made you focus on the Barbie? Like, why did you feel like focusing on the Barbie was the right choice? Does that make sense?
I mean, I think, part of what I do in telling the history, Barbie is not in my book because I wrote it before I started thinking about Barbie, to be honest, when the Barbie movie came out. And I think it's really important to think, the reason I use that example in this talk is because I really want to push us to think about Jewishness and creation really capaciously, really broadly, right? Obviously, I could have started with Jodi Chicago. I could have done a whole hour on May Rockland-Tupa alone. And if you don't know her work, there's a wonderful entry on her in the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia. The reason Barbie is so interesting is precisely because she's unexpected, because the Jewishness of Barbie has been erased. I actually did start to think about Barbie in 2008, when the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a wonderful organization, created a lesson plan for teaching about Barbie in the classroom, because very few people knew the history of Ruth Handler Moscow. I did, because of that lesson plan, and because a Jewish woman scribe named Jen Taylor Friedman, who's a Soferet, meaning she scribes Torahs, which is another form of different kind of discipline, but she actually writes out the Torah scroll, which was traditionally done by men, and she created a Barbie called Tefillin Barbie. Barbie wears Jewish phylacteries and a Jewish prayer shawl, and she's not in the talk today, but she's in a lot of my lesson plans. And she did that partially to draw attention to Barbie's Jewish past and make it explicit, and partially to play with our ideas about gender and Jewishness. And so why Barbie is precisely because she's so unexpected, and because one of the things that I think and teach about is how Jews relate to the American experience. And sometimes that's in a really obvious way, like May Rockland-Tupa and Siona Benjamin and P.G. Levy are all artists who are in a very obvious way saying, I'm going to make art about my American Jewish identity and really put it forward in front and center. But I think Barbie is a helpful framing for that, just because we don't always notice what's right in front of us. And so I chose Barbie precisely because it's counterintuitive and because, when I saw the film, I knew her history. And so I will admit, I got a little bit teary the first time Ruth Handler shows up in the film, which is midway through. But I also found it very interesting to see her Jewishness disappear, although I wasn't really that surprised. I think it would have been a little weird if there would have been different problems if they had emphasized it.
Thanks, Jodi. I'll ask you a question. You brought up teaching. Can you give us an example, whether it's something that you've covered in the talk or not, of an artist or a specific object or set of objects that led to particularly interesting discussions in the classroom that your students really responded to in really meaningful ways? I can put you on the spot to ask that.
That's such a good question. Aside from pictures of Tefillah and Barbie, which always work, I would say, and I teach a class about food, which is of course an object, sort of. It depends where I was teaching is actually the really good answer. Because when I taught in Oshkosh up the road, I was teaching in a town where very few of my students were Jewish. I was very often the first Jew. I happened to be Jewish, and that's not my qualification for teaching Jewish studies. My qualification is a BA in Jewish studies and a PhD in religion. But I was also often the first Jew my students had met sometimes. And so I would bring, Jewish ritual objects into the classroom because I think tactility is really important. And I found that prayer shawls actually provoked amazing discussions precisely because I would bring in a variety, precisely because there is just so much to talk about, because touch is one author says touch is the forgotten sense, and it's the one that in at least American culture, visual and oral have tended to dominate. So the prayer shawl in the Wisconsin classroom was immensely provocative and led to just wonderful discussions and comparisons with ritual clothing and other traditions, right? And Lehigh, at Lehigh, this is funny. It was a rubber ducky, because I taught a class last fall called, it was an honors seminar called Sensing Religion. So we examined all religions through the lens of the five senses, which is funny because we mostly experience things synesthetically with multiple senses at once. And on the first day of class, I just brought in a bunch of random objects and didn't tell students, I was like, whether or not they had anything to do with religion. And I just gave them to the groups and said, here, describe everything you can. And the funniest one was a rubber ducky I had bought on a whim, and the only time I was ever in Amsterdam. And it is a rubber ducky that looked like a stereotypical Hasidic rabbi. So it had a little black hat. And for some reason, it was holding a menorah. I don't know why. And it was a rubber ducky. And I said, guys, your assignment is explore all of these objects with all of your senses, as many senses as possible. And the rubber ducky was the best one because they thought to squeeze it. So they thought about sense, they thought about touch, sight, smell, and sound. And second, because some of the students looking at the rubber ducky were Jewish and some were not, and this led to like a little intercultural encounter. So I would have to give it up to the rubber ducky from Amsterdam.
Well, that's a wonderful response. Thank you. Yes, Marshall.
First of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful experience learning about fabric art. When I was growing up, that was part of a basic education for every family. That's not the case anymore. So that sewing and fixing socks, darning socks, can you imagine the current population darning socks anymore? the point I'm trying to make is it came natural for the woman of the house to be able to do things with a sewing machine and doing art and fabric art in particular. So do you find that now it's become an artesian quality for someone in the arts to create these, as opposed to every household expected to have a sewing machine and someone who knows how to use it?
That's a good question. I would say yes and no. I would say yes, like in terms of just basic skills. And I don't think this actually just applies to the fiber arts. I think it also applies to things like cars. I learned how to change my own oil when I had my first car. I can't do that anymore because the car is more complicated and I forgot how. But yes, also, right, sewing machines. My grandmother had a sewing machine. My mother had a sewing machine. And this was often not necessarily gendered in England in particular. Men could darn socks, always Scotland, men knit. But yes, in general, that being able to do it yourself thing for people of a certain class also, it's also class, right? I can afford to take my car to the dealer, that has declined. I think that both, we've had waves. The 1970s were one, the early 2000s were another, and COVID was a third, where you get these reclamations of people doing DIY things, but you're right, it's recreational, right? People didn't keep baking sourdough when they went back to the office after COVID because it takes forever. So I think mostly, yes, there's been a decline in a lot of those skills. I don't think they're completely gone. I think it'll be interesting to see also. I think that actually because of the environmental movement is where I would look to see some of these things revive, because when you look at people upcycling, recycling, reusing, especially in fashion, a lot of my friends, teenage kids, they've learned to sew. They learned to go thrifting and to remake the clothes. And so I don't have numbers on that. That is anecdotal. But I think it'll be interesting to see, especially as economies change, what happens with that.
Not a question, but because I know some people in the room are doing this, I want to say online, people say, I still darn socks. And somebody else makes the point that darning and mending are actually on an upswing because of an increased concern for sustainability. So great minds think alike.
Do you see any conflict at all between the prohibition in the Torah against making pestles, sculptured things, and the creation of something like Barbie?
Yeah, usually the question is about, figural images of humans. No, actually, I mean, I'm not a rabbi. I'm a PhD, not a rabbi, so I don't make rulings on that stuff. But when we look at Jewish history, we see a really long history of both Jewish visual arts and Jewish sculptural arts. I know more about the visual, and we do see times like with these famous Haggadot or Jewish prayer books for Passover, where the human heads have been replaced with birds' heads. So we do see some medieval moments and other moments where we see people backing away from showing human figures. But we have all of these sculptures and mosaics and drawings of human figures throughout Jewish history. As a side note, throughout Muslim history too, I've heard some art historians talk about that, but that's not my field. So I would say it's at least in the historical record, we see it happening in many time periods. So Barbie's not really a problem from that standpoint. As far as people's own personal decisions, that's like a sort of a rabbinic thing, and that's above my pay grade. But probably not for most people.
First of all, thank you so much. This has been really interesting and enlightening, and I've learned a few things tonight. I'm a mosaic artist, And you just used the word mosaic and you used the word repurposing. And that for me is a very integral part of the art that I make, is repurposing things. Either an object becomes decorated with mosaic that was not decorated previously, or an object becomes symbolic of something, maybe a midrash or a historic piece or a biblical story. So I was kind of looking for you to maybe cover it's a tactile art. It's not stitching, it's not material, but kind of, I was also listening to see, commentary in regard to that as well.
Just to clarify, do you mean specifically mosaics or specifically symbols, or both, or repurposing symbols, or both? Right. Of course. Right. Yeah. No, it's again mostly about the abundance of images in the book. I remember there was a point at the end where I wrote, "I'm sorry, there's so many more objects, I have to stop." I was actually thinking about ancient mosaics, partially because I was just at a conference on Second Temple Judaism. So I was thinking about the synagogue floors at Beit Alpha, and others which, show ancient Jews engaging with images from the zodiac, right? And so we have these images from the early, first millennium of mosaic floors that ancient Jews were making. So that's a very, very old example of a Jewish mosaic that we know existed in synagogues. I'm thinking of a sculptor I interviewed in the Lehigh Valley area. I'm trying to remember if she did mosaic work. She did a lot, but there may have been some mosaics on the sides of some of her things. Collage is not mosaic, but was another thing that I encountered a lot. Paper collage is actually in the introduction of the book. So I think that Siona Benjamin did a kind of a mosaic floor. It was commissioned for a synagogue where she designed. She doesn't do the mosaic or tile art or anything like on the tactile part herself. She just does the visual design. And then they worked with someone who actually worked in tile. So it was a collaboration. And they created this whole it was a zodiac floor, kind of recalling those ancient synagogues. So we have lots of examples of it. It wasn't, because I ended up limiting the book to, at first the book was just about creativity, all of it. I was going to interview music people, I was going to interview creative artists, and that was clearly not going to work. So it ended up becoming tactility, and then the book ended up really becoming primarily fiber arts. So I know much less about mosaics, to be honest, but I would love to learn more, and it's obviously really important.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. I'm so glad that we had a lively audience to go along with a lively talk. Thank you for your wonderful questions and observations. Thank you again to Jodi Eichler-Levine for a wonderful 2025 Faith Sigmund Woman of Valor talk. And everyone have a good night.